Hey folks, welcome to the Voices Less Heard podcast with Dr. PMak. I'm really thrilled and so excited to be welcoming my next guest today. Today I'm speaking with Omar Yassin. Omar, an incredible, fabulous, and fantastic human being who I've gotten to know closely over the years. Omar has over 30 years experience working within the grant making sector, working to evaluate projects, assess projects, as well as support organizations doing amazing work across Canada. Omar Yassin Omar is a truly remarkable human being who loves social entrepreneurship ventures, who engages with newcomers, refugees, as well as newly settled people here in Canada, just to help them and ensure that they have all the things that they need to live a life that is full of possibilities here in Canada. Omar, I'm thrilled to have you on this show, my friend and my brother, and look forward to diving into the conversations that we're going to have here today on Voices Listed with Dr. PMak. Hey Omar, thanks for joining me for this conversation today. I'm so excited to be talking about a lot of things, particularly looking at the grant making and philanthropy sector here in Canada, but specifically talking about the experiences of Black people or people of African descent. And so welcome to the Voices Less Heard with Dr. PMak. And as you know, Omar, what I try to do on this show is to really just center and spotlight those voices that are normally not on the mainstream, and just to unpack ideas and pack the issues that affect various communities here in Canada and around the world. So welcome.
Well, Dr. PMak, thanks for having me. This feels surreal. We've had so many of these conversations throughout the years, and we've always talked about how do we capture these stories, and it's so exciting to be here to be able to talk to you and capture this moment.
Absolutely. And I think, when I think of where we come from, right? So I'm originally from Zimbabwe in Southern Africa. Storytelling has been really a traditional part and of our ways of being, right? That, stories are shared not only just for the joy of it, but really to pass on knowledge from one generation to the other. And certainly this podcast and this way is part of that traditional way of, hey, let's learn from one another, let's share stories, and let's tell the world what we know, right? So really excited to be with you here today. Now, to kick us off, Omar, when you think of your ontological perspective around grant making and philanthropy, what drives your work? What drives your perspectives around grant making?
Well, in a word, I guess it would be experience. I've been in that grant making world now since 2007, when I started working with a project called the Youth Challenge Fund in Toronto, which was intended to fund what's called priority neighborhoods and youth-led projects. And before that, I'd only come into interacted with funding through applying for grants. So it was a really mysterious world before that. You'd write a grant, you'd submit it, and then you kind of decide that there's some objective system that's taken place, and if my grant meets all the criteria and I've got the right answers, whatever the right answers are, then my grant will be selected. And that's always the way I've understood grant making until 2007, when I got into the other side of it, where I'm reviewing grants, and I realized two things. One, it's both very easy and it's very easy to give away money. Very easy. Very easy to give it away. You can go anywhere, offer people money, they'll take it. You'll say, hey, can you sing me a song? They'll sing you a song, then they'll take them. They'll do what you want. It's very easy to give away money. But it's also very difficult to give away money with any sort of strategy or intentionality or intent. Because people will tell you what they want, what you're trying to hear, and then you'll enter into all of these grays in terms of what do these words mean, and what does it mean to improve a community or to better someone's life. And you start to really get down these philosophical thoughts and questions.
Yep.
So at the beginning, I think I approached grant making very much procedurally and structurally. Well, what are the processes? How do we create applications?
Yep.
How do we do this kind of grant making process?
Mm-hmm.
And then at some point, when you kind of get very familiar with that, you start to indulge that other side of it. Well, how do we do this well?
Yeah.
How do we do this with intent? Mm-hmm. How do we do this with purpose? And that's when you start to engage with what, to go back to your question, sort of the ontology, how am I going to relate to grant making? What do I believe about us and who we are, and communities and what they are, and people and what they are? And how do we decide how we take these shared resources that we all create together and distribute it for the betterment of our society? These are, these questions are fraught with moral, ethical, ontological, epistemological questions. Yeah. And where I've gotten to now is, well, in order to answer that, you have to understand community in many ways, and you have to understand community more broadly than what you're comfortable with. You have to understand community from many perspectives, and in order to do that, what the grant making and philanthropic systems should be thinking about is, how do we get out of the way? How do we let community bloom in the multiple directions that they're going to bloom? Rather than trying to guide people. This is kind of where I'm at. That's my ontology of it now. Yeah.
Okay, so hold up. I want to take you back a little bit, because you said on the other side of the table first, right? So where you were applying for grants and, and assuming that the answers that you're putting down are going to, end in you getting money. So when you then went to the other side, which is where you were doing grant making, how was your experience then, right? Did you see what you thought as this is how the system working that way, or there was a whole different machine behind that was evaluating and adjudicating grants, contrary to what you were thinking would be what would work?
Yeah, when I went on the other side, I realized like my understanding of grant making was pretty naive. Like there can't be really objectivity, because it'll be questions like, is this a reasonable approach to improve community? Okay. Well, the answer to that really depends on who's answering the question. Like, who's deciding the reasonableness of that? Who's grading? No matter what kind of rubric you create, you might know this from like your teaching. No matter what kind of rubric you create, it's the assessor's lens that ultimately decides what's reasonable, what's practical, what's risky, what's not risky. So. When I got on the other side, I realized my naive thought was ever assuming that it could be objective. There's no way you could make it objective. I mean, maybe other than some sort of lottery where somebody, randomly gets a grant and there's no human intervention at all. As soon as you bring a person in, now their lens is deciding, is this worthy or is this not worthy? It's immediate.
So what then is the role of community in deciding, right, in bringing that lens? Because I'm writing a proposal because I'm seeing a need, right, that I want to address in my community, and then you are reviewing this grant from your subjective or objective or biased lens. What's the role of the community in forming that grant making process?
That's the crux of the matter, really. That's the question, the only question that matters in the decision-making process, which is, what's the lens that then decides what's worthy and what's not worthy? Who is that person? I think, like, you ask what's the role of the community. I think the role of the community is first to understand, to have a voice, but not the same voice everywhere. Like, it's not... It can't be fully democratic in that way, because these issues don't affect everybody the same way. So if there's a project that's happening in my neighborhood and it's for me and I go to that project, I shouldn't have the same say on, I should have the same say on whether that project is good for my community or not as somebody that lives, several neighborhoods away in the same city and in a totally different circumstance. Like, that's democratic, but it can't be democratic in that sense. It has to almost be allowing the person that's going to be most impacted by this to have the loudest voice. And then community has to exist in many communities that bring... So there is a community of people that will be impacted by that grant financially. They need to have a voice. There's a community of people that will be impacted by that grant programmatically. They need to have a voice. There's a community of people that will be impacted by that grant because it'll represent them as a demographic. Well, they should have a voice. But not all these voices should have the same weight.
Okay. That's interesting you say that though, right? So we think about the community voices, but then we also live in a reality where the one who has the money wants to play the tune, right? So
That's
where's
right.
the balance?
It's not balanced, Patrick. It's not.
Oh, okay.
The person that gives the money has all the say. I mean, it's true in granting everywhere. And
Okay.
the challenge for people that are trying to shift how those resources are deployed is you have to speak in a way that's compelling to the people that have the money. That's just
Okay.
a matter of fact of it, right? You have to speak in ways that they understand. You have to translate whatever ideas you have in ways that make sense to them, in languages that make sense to them. That's the situation we find ourselves in. That's
Yeah.
the slowness, the sort of the catch-22 of any sort of systemic change or shift in process and systems is you have to convince those that control the system, or you have to fight them. There's nothing, there's no other way. You either have to say, let's do this together, let's convince each other, or it has to be, I mean, that's, like I live in Canada, I live in Ontario, the people here whose systems and indigenous people here whose systems and processes were changed weren't convinced, they weren't convinced. Right? That is a different way, but that way is not good for any of us, right? We want to have a way where we convince each other and we progress together.
Yeah. Okay. So we move along on this, storyline, and so you get now in a place where you're, adjudicating grants and you're making all these decisions. Now, were you satisfied now, right? So initially you're writing and reviewing and submitting proposals. Now you're reviewing. Did you get to a place now where you're like, okay, now I understand how this machinery works? What made you stay in grant making instead of going back into grant seeking?
That's a great question. I mean, I've been working in grant making now, 17 years. So it wasn't any one decision to say, here's what I'm going to do for the next 17 years of my life. It was always sort of incremental, small decisions along the way that were reasonable in their context. And what happened is I became more expert at that role. And there are very few people that do grant making. And I got, these kind of, it allowed for career progress. But it also created a lot of angst. I've often thought about doing something else because in many ways, grant making, like we said earlier, is the way that the people that have the money, or can be the way that the people that have the money force those that don't have the money to dance their dance. That's what I said. Giving away money is easy. If you tell someone to dance, they will dance because you have the money.
Oh yeah, I'll dance.
And then they'll tell you, "Oh, I love dancing." Not only will they dance, they'll tell you dancing is my favorite thing.
And I can even do cartwheels while I'm dancing.
Oh, I love this dancing. I love the exact dancing that you're asking me is the dance, exactly the dance that I wanted to do. That's what they do.
Yeah.
And so. At different times you become aware of that, it's not a secret that, for example, for Black communities, immigrant communities, all of these communities that I identify with don't have access to the wealth because the people that have the wealth don't want to give them access. I mean, that's, so they'll create all of these systems that are meant to look objective, just like they looked objective to me when I was asking for grants. We'll create like financial statements and risk mitigation and risk assessment models and all. You'll create all of these things. But in the end, when you're not naive and you kind of see how this assessment has to be done, it comes down to the assessor. The rubric is irrelevant.
That's true.
To a large part.
Sure. Yeah. Wow. That's interesting. And so I want to move now to where you and I met, right? And so a backstory is, I was in a place where I was asking myself so many questions, right? I was like, well, I've been sitting on this side of the table applying for grants. It's not making sense. And, many times I'm getting denied and I'm not getting the funding that I need. I was like, and this was probably going back 15 years ago. And I've always had this desire since then to say, hey, I want to sit on the other side of the table. I want to know what it takes to make these decisions, because if I'm being denied, then I wonder how many people are being denied. And particularly, I wonder how many people who look like me or run organizations like me who are, Black-led, Black-serving, and Black-focused. I wonder how many of us are being denied access to funding because maybe we're not speaking the language, or maybe we are not dancing well enough and doing those cartwheels as we ask for as we seek the funding. And so an opportunity arose, and I was sitting in front of you and another colleague interviewing me. And I remember the perspectives that you brought in that interview made me say, you know what, I want to work for this man, because this is exactly where I've been. I want to be part of a solution that centers Black people, but not only just Black people, but provides a way of spotlighting what we later termed system alternatives, right? To say you've got a mainstream system, but hey, there are also other ways of doing other things, right? And so that's where we met. So speak to me a little bit about your idea of centering community in grant making, and then we'll talk a little bit about how that work evolved into the grant making model that we then co-developed.
Man, brother, like Patrick, that was a great time. You took me back to that interview right now. I remember, I remember when we met. We're having this conversation, and even in that interview, right? It was such a special space because what happens to me is I'm working at Ontario Trillium Foundation. I've been working there for a long time doing grant making.
Yep.
And then they have this opportunity. They've partnered with this organization called FFBC. I'd never heard of them until then.
Okay.
And I look into them, and it's something called Foundation for Black Communities. And think to yourself, well, what is this? And they're talking about this report called Unfunded. And this unfunded report, I read through it, and none of it is surprising. I mean, it's telling me Black organizations are funded less. I started in 2007 to fund Black organizations because they were being funded less. It's always been the same story. I mean, it's globally true, it's locally true, it's true at any scale,
So what was new about this, right?
There was nothing new about it. But what was interesting about it is they'd written it in a way that was compelling to the people that had money. They'd jump that hurdle that's always there, that hurdle that slows systemic change, that hurdle that keeps the status quo. They jumped it because this document was compelling was compelling enough that people said, let's mobilize money. So at that time I'd been working, for more than a decade in grant making, certainly more than a decade. And I get the opportunity they say, well, they're starting up a new grant making department with this foundation. Are you interested in working there? And I'm overwhelmed by the question because I have this understanding that it's easy to give away money. If the goal was, hey, can you go over there and just give away this money? Sure, of course we could. Of course we could. No problem. But it's very difficult to do it with intentionality. It's very difficult to do it with purpose. And this purpose especially was so linked to major systemic issues. Why Black people aren't getting the same kind of funding is not a Canada question, right? That's a question that goes beyond Canada. That's a question that's a question that goes beyond now. It's a massive question. So I'm standing there and I think to myself, FFBC is this idea and this opportunity and this attempt, really. It's a recognition and a translation of the fact that Black people are not getting equal access to this fund. So there are ideas, ways of knowing, approaches, people being left out of the systems that form the society we live in. It's an encapsulation of that and a vehicle to make that recognized and convince the people that have the... But it's also this hopeful message that somehow using the same system, using a foundation model, using the same structures that we're stuck in, that have not given money to people, using those very same structures, we can somehow repair this issue. We can somehow alleviate this divide. And it was...
And I think it was in that conversation, I normally call my interviews conversations, and it was in that conversation that, it made sense to me, right? And I think this is where, I think it was you who said, hey, Patrick, it doesn't make sense to fight a system that perpetuates itself and, changes over time to serve the very same beneficiaries it wants to serve. So instead of fighting the system, let's begin to create what we call a system alternative, right? So speaking to your point, to say, hey, we'll work within this foundation to ensure that the grant making in the way that we think should be done will be done, right? And so take me to a time now where we began that process of creating a grant making philosophy or strategy. What was going through your mind based on your experience? And you were my boss, right? So you were setting the bigger vision. What was in your mind then about, hey, this is the philosophical stance we want to take?
Well, there's a few things that informed that stance early on. Mm-hmm. Early on in making a decision about which direction we're going to go, how are we going to solve this very challenging puzzle. Mm-hmm. There's one thing that we became convinced of, which is black communities have been kept out of this wealth. You know, many communities have been kept out of this wealth, but specifically black communities have been kept out of wealth and resources for centuries. It's not a new phenomenon. Yet here we are. Yet here I am sitting at this table making this decision. How does that come to be? That doesn't come to be because of the kindness and the generosity of a system that has intentionally excluded black communities all this time. It comes at the intelligence and wisdom and creativity of those that manage to not only exist outside of those resources and systems, but to thrive outside of them. Thrive so much that I now stand at the center of that system, able to pull levers, you know? It was sort of not an aha moment, but more of a profound shift in the lens which then I approached grant making. At that moment I decided, well, Foundation for Black Communities isn't a foundation that teaches black people how to dance the dance that the system wants them to dance, because they'll never dance that. It's been hundreds of years. Black people have always been capable to do that dance if that dance was all that was required. That's not what's required. What's required is that for the system to dance the dance that these communities, that has allowed these communities to thrive, and to now take something that, you know, communities have thrived on with very little. Imagine if you put resources into it now. Imagine what this could be. And imagine what it could be, not just for black communities, but for any communities that have found themselves thriving outside the system. Indigenous communities, communities of people with disabilities, the LGBTQ+. I mean, there's many of these communities that identify themselves and have figured out ways to exist outside of this oppressive system and thrive. So that's the first realization. We say, well, this foundation is not about building up black people. It's about building up a system to recognize this wealth of intelligence and capability that it's been missing out on, but that has been so powerful that it has allowed groups of people to thrive without the resources that the system has always had. And then the second thing became, well, then what is the approach to doing that? Well, we decided early on the approach is figuring out the way to build, and there's a visual description, bridges from the resources of the system out to these other ways of working that have always existed. And we started to call these alternative systems that exist outside of that main one, that have allowed these people to thrive, that if invested in with intentionality and purpose and with a lens of learning from those systems, could help bring all of those systems together to not have one singular system, but to have many systems that complement each other and allow for everybody to thrive in a different way, you know? So this was the first core idea. Black communities don't need to be built up. What they need is for the system to recognize ways of investing in things that have already been working for these communities.
I love that. I love that, right? Things that have been already working in these communities. And we'll talk a little bit more later about what was working and how did black people and how do they still continue to spotlight the things that have been working. So here you are, you're in charge of this grant making system now. So you agree to, take the role, and then you have to build up a team. I'm curious. I've never asked you this question. I don't know if our guests would love to hear, but I come along. Now, why did you hire me? Oh my gosh. That may be wrong question, but yeah.
I'll tell you, Patrick, like the hiring of this was, well, we need people that understand the central problem, that understand what we mean when we say black people do not need to be built up. It's a system that needs to be changed to understand the way the black communities have been working. And you would be surprised at the number of black candidates that we had that had difficulty understanding or articulating that point. It always came from sort of this position that, hey, you know, if we take our kids to school and we do what the system tells us to do in the way that the system tells us to do it, then we will be brilliant. I mean, that's what we're trying to get to. And then we have this conversation with you, and you're talking about, you know, your understanding of early childhood education and the many modalities that exist in that. You're talking about, you know, Black communities and Black knowledge and the way. And you came in immediately under. I mean, we didn't even have to explain that to you. You understood that central tension, and that was really important for this team because what this team of people that we're going to design this, that we're going to co-lead this, we're going to have to do is, one, no one of us could do it because we're going to need a lot of ideas, a lot of thoughts, a lot of work to do this. And two, we're doing something that nobody else is doing. Nobody else is out there saying that Black people already know what they're doing, and it's a failure of the system not being able to invest in them. That Black people do not need to be built up. That there isn't some objective, singular way of doing things, but rather there are many ways of doing things and many ways that have been working for a long time. True. And immediately, in our first conversations, you know, we started talking about models that work, ontologies that work in other places. And it is through those conversations, Patrick, right, that we arrive at saying, well, if we're going to approach the system differently, then we have to approach it with a different understanding of who we are in relation to who community is.
That's right. Yeah.
And you brought that lens. And I would say without that team of people that we had, it would have been impossible to do this work. It would have been impossible to do this work.
And I think you know, and thanks for saying that. I think it takes our greater recognition, right, as individuals, particularly as people of African descent, as Black people, to know where we are coming from, to know our history, to know what grounds us, right, and then to be firm enough in that conviction and belief to say, hey, I want to be a part of something that will bring in some form of change, right? Yes. Not just for me, but for 7 generations down. I think that was the idea that resonated so much for me in joining the organization. And again, credit to you as our team leader, as our boss, then for bringing together a team of absolutely brilliant-minded folks that to this day I cherish having worked with, right? Who were not only creative, but also, to your point, brought this recognition of this is where Black people have been. This is where people of African descent have been. It's not that they can't dance, but they are dancing to a tune that is created in a setting that's far removed from theirs.
That's it. I mean, that's it. And what an opportunity we had to be able to even say that, right, Patrick? One of the things that work made me realize is how important it is to insist on the existence of Black consciousness, Black modalities, other ways of doing things. Because as time goes on, the colonial structures in which we exist, kind of the systems in which we exist, become more ubiquitous and less offensive. It starts to become more and more like this is the way the world is supposed to be. You know, this is the way, of course. Yes, if you do these things as we tell you and you walk the path and you work hard, you can retire, and that's the purpose of life, and this is the way we should relate to each other as nations and cities. And but that's not the only way that exists, right? And there has to be spaces where we can say, wait a minute, everything that we think is right, even myself having grown up in this system, everything that we think is right might not be. And there might be other ways that people are living that are just as functional. You know?
And these are the stories that we began to unpack. And so we move forward, we start working as a team, and we begin to think about what is grant making, right? And going back to squares to really where it all started and say, hey, the traditional ways of grant making have always worked to some extent, but Black people, and this is a conversation that I remember as a team, right? Black people in particular have always been giving back to their own communities. We've always had our own models of giving to community, right? And so the key, and you asked this question, so what is it that we're going to do differently as an organization? If we know that we've always been giving back, in fact, if we know that we've always had ways of creating wealth, among our community. And we talk about and we did speak about the susus, for example, the ways of generating income and investment income within the community, and the susus or mukandos, in Zimbabwe where I come from, it's called mukando. Or some now start calling them rotational credit and savings schemes or Roscas, and but these are things that our great grandmothers used to do. If it wasn't money, then it was cattle or goats, or there were ways of doing things. But what was central to this team was, with all of this knowledge that we have, with all of this indigenous epistemology that we hold, how do we turn that into a functional grant-making model and philosophy and way of doing things that represents us, that represents, the identity? Now, again, we talk about alternative systems. There is a system that has been used, a traditional grant-making system. Well, let's also provide a system or spotlight a system that we've always used. And so talk to me a little bit now about how you led us into thinking about how do we center our Africanness? How do we center our indigenous epistemology into developing what we then call the Ubuntu grant-making model? What was going through your mind as you led us through this process?
Yeah. A lot, a lot was going through my mind. And even just when you bring up these things, grant-making is at its core really something that we can all understand. Like I always tell this. I say, you're walking down the street, somebody comes and asks you, "Hey, can I have $5?" Yeah. In that moment, you can understand all of the human impulses. Even as a thought exercise, you can understand all the human impulses that create the systems of granting, which is, if I give you this $5, what are you going to do with it? What are you going to do this with? Why do you need this $5? Yeah. What's in it for me if I give you this $5? These very human questions are what then creates systems of granting. Because people need to have trust that their money is good. True. So there's two things. One, we needed to be engaging with, you can't ignore those human impulses, because those are not necessarily cultural. Anywhere in the world you go that there are people, you ask somebody for something, even if they give it to you, they have to have an understanding of why they're giving it to you. True. Something that compels them to. So we said, we're going to create a grant-making system that meets those human impulses, that answers the question, what are you going to do with this money? Why do you need it? Why is it important? It's going to answer those questions. To the people that have the money, it's going to answer those questions. Yeah. But the way that we're going to answer those questions is not taking the existing system and optimizing it. What we're going to do is take the existing system and transform it. Transform it by starting at the very point of these two people. How do they relate to each other? What are they to each other? Are they discrete individuals? And this new transformational system that we're going to present to the grant-making world, we wanted it, and we had this conversation. I think it was you and I, maybe the whole team, but we talked about it has to have a name that clearly indicates that this is a fundamental shift in the lens with which you approach grant-making. And Ubuntu lent itself to that, because Ubuntu is a fundamental ontological shift from the idea of discrete individuals to this idea of a symbiotic whole. We all need each other, and that any part of this whole should be able to be trusted by the other part to say, hey, there's something going on over here. And that it has to work together and have that whole collective lens and collective decision making. It allowed us to name that ontological starting point, that shift, right? It allowed us to name it, and then overlay it over the idea of, well, we take the system, now the system is not at the top of a pyramid defining to everybody how they should be, but the granting system is now placed in an Ubuntu lens where it belongs in a community of decision makers, in a community of knowledge. And it has its role to play, but it doesn't play the role of everybody else. And it has to allow space for everybody else to come in, or it won't know what's going on in the rest of the organism. So by using this Ubuntu lens, by using the language of Ubuntu, it allowed us to immediately, in the minds of people, position our work as transformational, not optimizing.
I love that. And so for our listeners listening, and so Ubuntu really is an African philosophy centering out of South Africa, but certainly, throughout Southern Africa, you can hear this, resonance of Ubuntu. And it just at a basic level, at a surface level, means I am because we are. So this means, this is the idea behind compassion and humanity, sort of talking about the warmth, the care, and the community-mindedness of African culture is essentially what Ubuntu is. And if I remember well, we had, Tata Nelson Mandela being one of the proponents of Ubuntu. We had the late, again, Desmond Tutu, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, speaking and advancing this concept of Ubuntu, right? That my wellness is inextricably linked with Omar's wellness. And when we look at African culture and systems and ways of being, that we are all interconnected, right? And so you often hear, and I think it was, in Hillary Clinton's book, where she wrote about, in Africa, they say it takes a village to raise a child. Principally, it means that we all have to take care of each other, right? And so as we're thinking about this grant making model, we're like, well, why are we getting and giving grant dollars anyway? This is about strengthening community. This is about ensuring that we emphasize the interconnectedness of human beings, as well as the importance of community. And so I think, not only was Ubuntu as a philosophy one of our anchors, Omar, we also thought about Harambee, right, from Kenya, is how do we move together, right? And Harambee being that movement that was, being driven back in the early 50s, 60s by Jomo Kenyatta, talking about we need to move together. But not only do we need to move together, we had the principle of umoja that we were thinking of as well. And umoja is speaking of togetherness, being united, right? And so I remember as a team, we're sitting there and we're just brainstorming, having this thought partnership, and we're saying, wow, we love all of these concepts, right? Because they speak into this way of being, into this ontological framework of Africanness, of togetherness, of, umoja, together in unity, Harambee, together moving forward. And then Ubuntu, I am because we are. So that's really part of the things that we're discussing and thinking about and saying, now, how do we propose this alternative grant-making system that centers, right, the community, that centers community participation? So speak to me and speak to us a little bit about the principles that then anchored this Ubuntu participatory grant-making model.
That's so well stated, because one, the approach itself, especially as you've described it, and as we've been talking about it, is itself a demonstration of a system alternative. Mm-hmm. Is itself a demonstration of what it is that we can learn from Black communities and the way they've been able to relate to each other. Mm-hmm. These ideas, these philosophies that these communities have used in order to sustain and thrive in the periphery. It was a demonstration of how we can use that and apply it right now. Mm-hmm. Secondly, to think of that demonstration, you just think about that same thought exercise. Yep. Two people meet each other in the road and one person asks another for $5. Now, overlay Ubuntu understanding on that. And now these two people, what's the relationship between them? It's not wealth owner and person asking for it. It's two people that are in the same group, in the same organism, in the two people that so just as the person giving the money is responsible for the well-being of the person receiving it, the person receiving the money is responsible for the resources being given to them. It puts them on equal footing and gives both of them responsibilities to each other. And it changes now. The same questions come up, the same questions of what are you going to do with this money, given limited resources. But the way you answer them and the way you think about those questions fundamentally shifts. And this is, I think that little thought exercise demonstrates why Ubuntu is a systemic shift. It's a shift in the way that we think about each other, and then subsequently shifts everything else that we do. So from that perspective, when we go into Ubuntu now as a grant maker, we have this relationship with the applicant or the person that's going to be receiving a grant from us, that we are on equal footing in a sense, that we need them. We need them to tell us their expertise. We need them to tell us how can I improve my life by improving yours? How can I improve my community by improving? We approach them as experts. We approach them as knowledge holders. Right? And when we give them the money, we trust them as giving them our resources. Not giving them our resources, but shared resources.
Shared resources,
Shared resources. And these principles then allow us to create a decision-making model that's based on an Ubuntu lens, where the people that are closest to what's happening, that are closest to the issue being resolved or the opportunity being taken advantage of, we give them a voice. We give them our trust to say, our destinies are intertwined with yours. You know, if you take your community and you make it thriving and beautiful and sustainable and healthy, we all become healthier and more and happier and more sustainable as a result. It's an insistence on that principle. It's an insistence on understanding the expertise of applicants and making them the knowledge holders, the decision makers all along the way. But without taking out the funder, because the funder still has a role. The funder is also in this community. It's not to the exclusion of the funder. It's not tokenizing anyone. It's literally saying, we are starting from an Ubuntu lens. We believe that we are all intertwined.
No. I love that, and so it was community participation, right? Is that the voices of the community are really deeply rooted and centered, right, in this process? That it is shared decision making, as you mentioned. It is shared resources, but even more importantly for me too was just this principle of transparency and accountability, right? That because it's shared resources, it's shared decision making, all aspects of the grant making process had to be transparent, right?
Well, and you know, you were talking earlier about Susu, Patrick, right?
Yeah.
And one of the lessons that we learned from Susu as a team was this is money being exchanged. There's no financial statements. There's still a trust question. There's still a trust mechanism, but it's being done differently. And it's the realization of transparency as a mechanism for trust, right? It's the understanding that if you're transparent, if everybody knows where this money is going, right? Then we don't need to have these discrete statements that we hide from each other and so. And I'm not saying that the financial statement model is wrong. I'm just saying it's not the only way. Obviously, if you look at Susu's, there are other models of trust. And we took a decision right at the beginning there to say we're going to believe in those other models as well. And where there is something that makes us uneasy, something that comes against the way that the system is designed now, we're going to learn. We're not going to say no, we're going to learn. We're going to learn why is it uneasy, why is there problems, and how do we build the bridge to connect those models to the others, right?
And just to pause you there a bit, and I wanted to bring in hopefully some definition for our listeners here. And you know, we talk about susus and mukandos and stuff. So basically, a susu is almost something that's akin to a merry-go-round, right? But in this way, it's sort of a form of a rotational or rotating savings and credit association, right? So a really informal way of lending, an informal club where, you know, 3, 4, 5 people come together, agree on an amount that they want to invest amongst themselves, right? And so you say it's $100 each month, right? So one person gets, you know, $400 from the other 4 members a month, and then the next month it's another person getting money. And so it has had different names, and it does have different names, you know, across I mean around the world. In Africa, you know, depending on which region or which, you know, area of the continent you are in, it's got different names. But what happens is that each recipient changes every month until all members have managed to receive money, and then once they are done, they would want to start again and do that, right? So whether it's to buy household furniture, it is to start businesses, it is to meet some day-to-day expenses, these susus or loan clubs are really highly informal. And to Omar's point too, right, that there is no credit check, there is no forms of, you know, income and expenditure statements that are being asked. It's really a community-generated approach to wealth, you know, management. And again, with it, there's a lot of transparency, right? And if one member, and I used to belong to a couple of these, and if one person is seeing their income, like, I might not make it, you know, to pay, they'll quickly, you know, tell and say, hey, I might not be able to make my commitment this month, right? And so if there's someone within the club who's able to, give you the $100, they'll give you the $100 so that the pot is still enough for everyone, right? And so really this was just a community, and I love the way it worked. And as we did our research, prior to launching this Ubuntu participatory grant making model, we said, there are systems that we can use. There are systems that are generated within our people of African descent. And Susu, was commonly used in Jamaica. And so there is a way that we can actually, get this concept right. Oh, it's Susu in Jamaica, but I remember it's a Mukando in Zimbabwe.
It's called Partner in Jamaica. It's Hagbit for the Somali community, especially in Toronto. When they first started immigrating in the late 80s, early 90s, en masse, there's no system of wealth. And until now, there are what's called Hegbit or Ayuto. There's many names. There's some of them that are still going on now that started in the 80s.
In Cameroon,
There's some that are going on continuously from the 80s. There are some that have as much as $150,000, $200,000 exchange. And it's based on transparency and trust. If you want to come into the circle, somebody brings you in. And on that person's trust, on that person's name.
True. And you know what was fascinating for me, boss, at that time, and I still call you boss, so I hope you don't mind. What was fascinating, even as I did research to bring back to the team around this concept, was I discovered there was a group in Toronto, right, that had started this concept to buy haulage trucks. And they, the couple of black men and elders that had gone from bank to bank to bank to bank looking for loans to start up their business, but they couldn't find it. And then they said, you know what? We are our own saviors. Why don't we generate this money amongst ourselves? And they started doing this. And to this day, I understand that they're running a multi-million-dollar trucking business here in Canada. The system, whatever way you want to call it, whether it's the banking system, didn't recognize them and didn't believe in them to give them loans to start this business. They looked back and said, hey, we can do this. Let's go back to our own traditional ways of raising resources and let's do it. Now they have a multi-million-dollar business, and I'm told that the banks were now chasing after them. Right?
Doesn't it make you think, though, Patrick, what could the world look like if the mainstream understood these philosophies and processes and didn't have to bend and become them, but created the space for them to exist as well? What would that look like, right? What would it look like if somebody could come and, based on the strength of their, Susu record and the connections that they have, that they could then, because the person that's making the decision on whether they get a mortgage or not can understand, they have a Susu back in them, they can pay this way, and I trust them because they know this person, and I have this philosophy and I understand it, and they could engage with that. Imagine if we had all of these different ways to engage with these systems. Wow. Rather than the singular way that says you have to do this, you have to dance this dance, and then we'll give you the money. Understanding at their core that neither is objective, that both come down to the decision of the decision maker. Right?
It's and talk about just decision of the decision maker, but even you and there's a point that I wanted to touch on before I forget. This shared decision making in this communal process. One of the examples that I give to anyone who cares to listen about these ways of being and ways of knowing is I also met, and worked with another group that was based in the Jane and Finch community. And so we would send emails to them. They'd put in a proposal to the organization, and so we'd send in, and they were part of my grant slate, and so I would send emails to them, and an email would take 3-4 days before being responded to. And so I always used to wonder, right? Because I'm coming from this thinking, when you get an email from a funder, you're like, okay, I'm going to jump on it, I'm going to do it, I'm going to respond because it's money potentially. They'll take, 3 days, 4 days. And then eventually we got to set a meeting, and I, set a virtual meeting, Zoom meeting with 5 elders from the Somali community out in the Jane and Finch. And so, introduced myself and then just as the meeting got started, they said, hey, Patrick, it's nice to meet with you and thank you for being generous and kind with your emails. And we just wanted right off the bat to apologize and, say, hey, we are sorry for taking time to respond. But here's how we work. We've got one email address that is accessed by all of us. And so every time an email comes, we read it and then we take time to communicate amongst ourselves and then agree to send you a feedback. And then I was like, hold on. You mean you've got one email address that you all access as a group, and once you get an email in there, you just don't read and respond. You actually take a step back and say, hey, there's this email that has come through. What is our collective response to this email? Transparency, accountability.
And valuing different things, right? Like, I mean, this is, if you value, you know, there's that cliche, right? If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, let's go together.
Go with others,
in that cliche, you hear kind of the choice there, which is efficiency, and to make that other choice is fine. You know, that also has value. Sure, efficiency has value. In certain places, it's the way, but it's not the bedrock on which every interaction should be built.
No,
you know,
no.
And what does it look like for systems to understand those things? What does it look like for financial systems to understand other ways of working things, to allow resources to be allocated to many different systems alternatives? And that's what we had the opportunity to do. You know, that's what we were working on. That's what how do we build? We were laying the bricks to that bridge.
Yep. And that was fantastic. I think, you know, I used to say to the team, like, you know, I can't wait for the next day because I can't wait for the new ideas that this team is building. And I remember one of the conversations that we had, and I hopefully pushed back in a way that was respectful to the team, but was this notion of capacity building, right? Like, you know, we have to think about capacity building and building the capacity of our communities to be able to do this. And I felt so strongly about it. And I said, no, I don't think the idea is about capacity building. I don't know if you remember that conversation.
Yes.
I think because capacity building is presupposing that the community does not have any capacity.
That's right.
It's presupposing that communities, particularly people of African descent or BIPOC communities, have got nothing. And whoever is coming in with the money needs to help build their capacity. So I say to the team, hey, I think this is wrong. And, you know, go back to 1972, I think it was the, you know, United Nations Conference on Water Solutions or something, where this term capacity building started coming up to say, hey, let's go out there and build the capacity of communities so that they can, you know, conserve water. And I said, no. I think the term that we should use is capacity development, right? Because our communities, our ancestors, our great-grandfathers had the capacity, had the ways of, I mean, we are here, we are standing on their shoulders now doing this work that we do because they had the capacity back then. So the notion that we need to use grants for capacity building, for me, still is, sounds a bit iffy because it brings in this whole power thing to say there is one organization that will give you money so that you can build your capacity, instead of there is one funder or partner organization that can work with you to develop your capacity. The capacity is there, it needs to be developed.
And then, you know, and further to that, I agree. And then further to that, I think, then you start to investigate, what do you mean by capacity?
Yep.
Right? Because sometimes what people mean by capacity is, let me teach you how to dance my dance. Let me teach you my steps.
Yeah.
You know, let me show you the way. And sometimes it's, no matter how you dance the dance, they'll say it's not quite right.
Yeah.
You know? So you think about capacity building for Black communities. I mean, let's say for 100 years now, Black communities have been trying to build their capacity, and yet the unfunded report comes out and still Black communities are funded disproportionately. Have their capacities not been built in the last 100 years? Do we need another, how many hundreds of years of capacity building do Black communities need before their capacity is good enough? Before we're not building their capacity anymore? You know? How many more? How many more hundreds of years? Maybe the issue is that no matter how I dance this dance, you'll say, there's something a little dark about you that doesn't quite make the dance seem right. You know, maybe let me teach you another time. Or you're dancing a little bit better, but still I can't, you know, it doesn't look quite as good as the other, and I can't trust you just as much. So, because we've been doing capacity building and it hasn't worked. Maybe what we need to say is, you need to build, I need to build, maybe it's the Black communities that need to build the capacity of the funders to be able to trust them. Maybe I need to build your capacity to be able to appreciate the way that I've been dancing all along.
Exactly.
And I think it's important to turn that conversation. I think it's important for that conversation to run both ways. Like, and again, Ubuntu allows us to do that because it's if you're granting from an Ubuntu lens, then the grant maker, if they say, hey, I have to build your capacity to be able to understand me, then if you're in a true Ubuntu lens, the grant maker must also say, and I have to build my capacity to understand you. Because otherwise we're not doing this right. Otherwise, I'm going to be blind to what's important to you. I'm going to be blind to what you can do. And the organism is not going to be healthy. All of it is not going to be healthy because it's skewed to one side. You know, you look at, I mean, I look at so many things. Like I look at, for example, indigenous communities in Canada and their capacity to manage 75,000 years of civilization without ruining the environment, without ruining the natural beauty of Canada. You know, 75,000 years of civilization. Well, why aren't we placing them in positions to build the capacity of government of Canada to understand what choices that we should make? You know, maybe we don't all have the nicest cars, and maybe we use rivers and boats. You know, we use man-powered canoes. Maybe these are the choices, not because they are less knowledgeable, but because they made different choices. They value different things. They see the world from different lenses. If I see the world as Ubuntu, I make different economic choices. I make different environmental choices all along the way. But we don't see it that way, right? In fact, what we see, what the popular narrative would be is the government of Canada has to build the capacity of Indigenous communities. But maybe it's Indigenous communities that need to build the capacity of Canada to work differently. And in that way, save us from these ills, you know?
And in that way too, when we speak about grant making, right? And I think it was very, very clear, you know, from our time, you know, with this organization was, hey, can we listen to communities? Can we take time to listen to communities, particularly people of African descent, because this organization, you know, was supposed to be and is serving that community. Can we take time to listen to them, to understand, right? Even within the community, there are different cultures and different subcultures, right? Can we understand the different expectations and values that they have regarding their experience to grant making? After listening to all of these, can we then ensure that the model that we are building is speaking somewhat to some of these values and contexts that exist? And one of the things that you'd always say in meetings, you and I fought a lot in meetings and bilateral meetings. And it was, I think that was my highlight, because it wasn't fighting or personality fighting. It was a contestation of ideas. It's like, hey, Patrick, this is what I see. And one of the things that I respect so much about you was, among many things, was, Patrick, I'm not married to my idea. I'm not married to my idea. I'm willing to listen to you, and if it makes sense, let's go for it. I've taken on that perspective to say, hey, there are so many ways of being, there are so many ways of doing out there, that my way is not the only correct way. And so to your point, perhaps it is the indigenous communities here in Canada that need to say, hey, this is how we've managed to keep the parks and the beauty and the lakes. This is how we've done it, right, over millennia. And this is perhaps the way that you should go, right? And taking time for us to listen. And this is certainly what we did as we developed this grant making model, taking time to listen to community. Now, I want to move you, and as we get to wrapping up.
Yeah.
When you think about the importance of the Ubuntu grant making, Ubuntu participatory grant making model going forward, what role do you see of this particular model in sort of community foundations and family foundations and in private? Do you see it as a space that as a tool that can be used for grant making broadly, moving beyond just people of African descent?
I absolutely think so, and I think the Ubuntu model is just one. It's just one demonstration. I mean, the whole premise is there are many ways of doing things. There are many systems alternatives.
Sure.
The Ubuntu model represents one approach that allows you to fundamentally shift the lenses with which you do granting and have different outcomes at the end. I think the Ubuntu model is applicable to any organization that's interested, or any group of people really, that are interested in doing truly transformational work. Like, if you believe that there are some issues that are endemic to the system, environmental issues, issues of wealth inequity, issues of racism and discrimination, if you believe these are endemic to the very lenses that form the system, the Ubuntu model offers you an alternative. It offers you another way to say, well, let's engage down this path, have different outcomes. Now, those outcomes, I'm not naive to think that those outcomes will not have their shortcomings and their pitfalls as well. Not their questions and difficulties. But it's not, at no point are we suggesting the Ubuntu model is the only right way. We're saying it should be one of many. And when we have all of those ways, if we hear each other, and we have many ways of engaging, and they're all give us many roads to getting together, then we'll have a more healthy collective. It will not be skewed in any one direction. So I think it offers grant makers a chance at transformational work, a truly transformational work. We got to try it 2 times. Really. I would have loved to have tried it 200. And iterate and learn from it. And understand from the feedback that we get from community, from the knowledge that we see in all of the various ways that there's knowledge, from the stories we hear, from the data that we gather, from all of the different things that can constitute knowledge, from that fulsome understanding, the way that we would have continued to pivot and the way that we would have continued to integrate our work with the way that funders are working, but also the way that community is working. I would have loved to have seen it, and I think that opportunity still exists,
Okay. So next steps with this model, as you think about the opportunity existing, how do you see it manifesting?
Well, I think the next steps is to continue to have these conversations that are becoming more and more salient now, as a result really of climate change. Climate change is the conversation that's pushing the need for systems alternatives. We see that no amount of carbon taxation or incremental pivots in a system that's fundamentally designed for capital production and productivity in that sense. No matter how much you play within the boundaries of that system, we're still stuck with this problem of problems of overconsumption and climate change. What people are more and more realizing is that there needs to be a fundamental change in the way that we see and relate to each other, in order for us to be able to address the questions of climate change. It's not a matter of optimization. The more we optimize our systems, the more climate change we generate, as a matter of fact. We're stuck in it. So I think from that space, I think Ubuntu has a really good ability to show value to everybody.
I love it.
Of course, Ubuntu has values to Black communities. It represents Black epistemologies and ontologies and ways of understanding and relating to each other, and has all kinds of social benefits of validating that indigenous communities that were colonized, that the colonial structures are not the right or only way to do things. And in fact, if we approach colonial structures as the right and only way to do things, we get stuck in situations like climate change. We get stuck in situations like global wealth inequity. We get stuck in these things with no real solutions, because we're continually consolidating into a colonial construct, And so this allows a break. This allows a life raft in the ocean to say, hey, what's going on over there? And then from there another, and then from there another. There are other communities in Canada, for example, the Indigenous People's Resiliency Fund is another project looking at this from the Indigenous lens. Well, what are those modalities? What are those precepts that allow us to do granting differently? So organizations like Community Foundations of Canada, philanthropic bodies, especially those interested in transformational change, I think Ubuntu offers a path, a framework, an understanding, a worldview that allows you to have a different beginning towards a different end.
Omar, a brother, a friend, a mentor, and community leader. Thank you so much, and I hope to have you around the next time. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. PMak.
Thank you for listening to the Voices Listed podcast with Dr. PMak. I hope you enjoyed insights that came out of this conversation. Keep your notifications on. Our next episode will be dropping soon. Thank you and enjoy.